Washington Journal continues.
We want to welcome to the table Erik Prince. He is the founder of Blackwater USA and now the chairman of Frontier Service Group. Good Friday morning. Thanks very much for being with us. Let's get right to it. This morning, an editorial in USA Today available online at usatoday.com. Earlier this week, you wrote the following, quote, "The president can restructure the war similar to a bankruptcy reorganization by aligning U.S. efforts under a presidential envoy. All strategic decisions regarding humanitarian aid and military support and intelligence become laser-focused on creating a stable, self-supporting Afghanistan. Stability would give our troops an exit ramp." We have been in Afghanistan for the last 16 years, so outline specifically what you want to do.
Sure. The president could pull everything out completely, which I think would be a bad idea because I think the Taliban and ISIS would end up taking over the country, and it would be a rally cry to every terrorist wannabe around the world that they'd beat the United States. Or we could keep doing much of the same that we have been. We're now spending more than we spent almost $1 trillion, now spending more than the entire defense budget of the UK just in Afghanistan. More than 2,000 American dead, 20,000 plus wounded. And healthcare costs from that war will be $1 trillion on top of it. And as Secretary Mattis said, we're not winning. The terrorist forces control almost half the country as it is now. So clearly this current strategy is not working. I tried to take a step back, and the reason I wrote a restructuring is to say let's pare away some of the incremental decisions we've had. We've had 17 different commanders in 16 years. Okay, so we've changed. There's not been a unity of command. And when I say you have to have one leader that's in charge of all things from the Department of Defense, state, intelligence community for Afghanistan and Pakistan. You have to have unity of command, one person that makes decisions forward, not 9.5 time zones away back here in Washington, to unify that. And second, to really support the Afghan security forces in a proven way. There's about 9,000 U.S. troops in country right now, another 4,000 NATO, and there's 26,000 contractors. So I'm not even arguing for an expansion of contractors. It would rather be a significant contraction of contractors and eventually really provide the off-ramp for U.S. troops. Left, right, or center, I think anyone would say, let's figure out how to be done in Afghanistan. To deny terror sanctuary and leave and be done. This is an approach that will get there, and it costs less than 1/5 of what we're spending now. It would return $40 billion back to the Treasury.
But can you compare this to anything else in our history? Have we tried this before, or other countries tried this before?
Well, this is, again, this is not unleashing private armies in any way. All this is doing largely what the U.S. Special Forces have done in Afghanistan. Okay, the Afghan Special Forces fight and function effectively. They do 80% of the offensive missions now as it is. They have been trained and mentored in the way that I'm recommending, where U.S. Special Forces operate alongside them. They live, train, and patrol together. The rest of the Afghan army has not been done that way. And so the U.S. guys live on one base and the Afghan guys live on another base, and they see them maybe once or twice a week. All I'm talking about doing is putting trainers, contract trainers, on a long-term basis that live, train, and patrol with those Afghan units and basically provide a structural support, a skeletal system that provides leadership, intelligence, communications, medical, logistics expertise for that unit, each of those Afghan battalions from the bottom up to depend on. Analogies from history, the Flying Tigers. That was a time when the United States was not in World War II and we needed to help China defend itself from Japanese aggression because they were bombing their cities. In that case, you had Americans as contractors went and fought and basically became part of the Chinese Air Force in 1940. Certainly the first foreign policy crisis America faced with the Barbary Pirates. That was led by William Eaton, one former Army officer, 8 Marines, and about 90 contracted professionals, Greeks, Italians, and Frenchmen. They ended up liberating the 340 American sailors that were held hostage by the Bay of Tripoli, 1805. There are plenty of examples throughout history. There's a lot of them that are still classified because there's more of this has happened than people want to imagine.
To our C-SPAN radio audience, our guest is Erik Prince, the founder of Blackwater USA. We do have a line set aside if you are a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. We've been there for the last decade and a half. 202-748-8003. We'll get to your calls and comments in just a moment. You've been to Afghanistan both as a Navy SEAL and with Blackwater, now Frontier Service Group. countless times. How did we get to this current situation? Why the stalemate?
You know, the Taliban was decimated in a matter of months after 9/11 by 100 CIA officers, a couple of hundred U.S. Special Forces, and air power. The Taliban are not 10 feet tall. They were truly decimated. They were brushed back. But the more we've turned it into a conventional army operation, we've gone backwards. And now we're at the point that the Taliban, having survived this for 15, 16 years, they're at their best. Those survivors of all those wars, they know exactly how the U.S. operates. They know exactly how the U.S. collects signals intelligence and surveillance and targets and all the rest. And so we have the finest military in the world if they could just get the enemy to fight them the way they want to fight. That's the problem. We have an amazing conventional capability, but fighting against guys in pickup trucks and flip-flops is a different war, and we've never truly adapted to fighting that kind of war with a military that was largely built to defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union.
The president yesterday saying he is expected to announce his decision soon. What if we pulled out completely? Then what?
You know, people say, what does victory in Afghanistan looks like? That's harder to define, but I can tell you what losing looks like. If the U.S. pulled back all support for the Afghan government, the Taliban and ISIS-type forces would end up taking over the country. They already dominate almost half the country as it is now.
And Senator John McCain yesterday announcing that he wants to see an additional 4,000 troops. His plan is to do what the U.S. did in Iraq to Afghanistan.
I think he's 4,000. It's basically more of the same. Look, we've had as many as 140,000 troops in country, 100,000 Americans and 40,000 NATO troops, and that didn't work. They can push in, you know, as the Taliban say, the Americans have the watches, but we have the time. So you have to do a sustainable, cheap, long-term strategy that helps keep unrelenting pressure on those terrorist elements. The U.S. Proclivity to want to surge, to want to go in there and rush and chase after them, that's a false presumption, because the enemy just ducks and covers. Then they have the time.
The founder of Blackwater and now Frontier Service Group, serving as the chair. Would your organization or organizations in any way benefit from this?
If there is a chance to do some of this work, we would certainly have a go at it as a bid. I was asked by folks at the White House after I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal to elaborate on that on the op-ed, and then end up making a detailed analysis of what the budget would take, because they wanted a comparison. And so I can honestly and clearly say this program would cost less than 20% than versus what the Pentagon is spending now. So at least I know what the numbers are and what this thing should cost.
And on a yearly basis, USA Today reporting that we're spending $50 billion a year. Does that sound about right?
Sadly, yes.
And your plan would cost about $10 billion.
Correct. And my plan includes a lot of the existing spending they're doing on the entire Afghan Security Forces budget, on the U.S. SOCOM budget, remaining there to keep active duty soft guys, and then this contracted piece would provide mentors at the battalion level across the Afghan army for the long term, some air, and then some governance support to make sure the Afghan military gets the logistics support they need. So when a battalion orders food, fuel, parts, or ammunition, they get it on time. Some medical support for them and some tactical intelligence. And I believe that's all that you really need to do to keep the Afghan forces upright. Beyond that, we're wasting money.
And what's your view of General Nicholson, who is the commander in Afghanistan?
I think he's been dealt a tough hand to play, because being the 17th commander in 16 years, he's living with all kinds of other people's incremental decisions, and no one's really been in charge there for a long time. And again, I had the advantage of being able to come with a clean sheet of paper and saying, this is what needs to happen to make this work. If the U.S. Army could suddenly send a brigade of sergeants, senior sergeants and staff officers to be that embedded mentor piece, I would shut up. But they can't. They haven't organized that way in 16 years. They used to do that back in the Vietnam War, where they embedded mentors into the Vietnamese battalions and operated with them. U.S. Army is not big enough to do that, and they couldn't maintain the rotations. They could strip enough sergeants away to do that, but they would render a third of the Army combat, inoperable.
And one final point before we get to calls, having served in the military and looking, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, the situation in North Korea, Is the military prepared for 21st century warfare?
Again, we have amazing conventional capabilities, but look at the last 2 wars we've been in, largely insurgencies. I mean, the conventional part of the Iraq War was quite small, quite short, and then it devolved into an insurgency. Afghanistan's been an insurgency almost the entire time. Getting a military in the paradigm, in a mindset, to be able to do both is very, very hard. And so coming at this, people might not like the idea of contractors doing this. Look, these are veterans that have already served in the U.S. military, served them well, going back and doing it again, deploying in a different model, but it's the same skill sets, it's the same people. We're a country of great innovation and flexibility in figuring out ways to solve problems. After 16 years, why not consider what has worked in the past?
But here's what Sean McFates of Atlantic Magazine says. Here's a crazy idea floating around Washington these days, outlandish, even by today's outlandish standards. The U.S. should hire a mercenary army to fix Afghanistan.
Well, he's wrong on a couple points there. One, the way these mentors would work is they would actually be adjunct. They would become attached to the Afghan army, which even by the UN definition doesn't make them mercenaries. Okay, so they're not mercenaries, and they're not this private army operating around Afghanistan. They're under the Afghan chain of command. They're accountable under the UCMJ, and they're there to serve as a support structure for the Afghan military. It's exactly what the U.S. Army should be doing, but for the last 16 years has yet been able to organize that way.
Our guest is Erik Prince. Nancy joining us from Concord, New Hampshire, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for taking the call. But, I mean, I have some real questions. I mean, as an older person, I am much older than Erik Prince, and I've been around for a long time. But I'm really curious because you don't seem to operate under any laws. Although you say you're part of the Afghan military, there was no central military or central government in Afghanistan before. There was always tribes. But I'm curious because your men actually were arrested for open fire in that square in Iraq when the civilians were all killed. But how did you get access to all of our Treasury money to build your own mercenary army in Afghanistan? I am appalled that we would even consider hiring mercenaries on behalf of the American government. We will never be done with terrorists as long as you continue to occupy Afghanistan. I mean, it is unbelievable 16 years later that we are pouring all this money in. Dick Cheney lied through his teeth, and you're a good friend of his. I mean, how did you get all of our money from the Treasury? I don't understand how you had it.
Thank you, Nancy.
So let me clarify on a couple things. We're not doing that work now. Currently, the U.S. military is doing it. They've been doing it for 16 years, and it's costing the taxpayers more than $50 billion a year. There is an Afghan government now. There's one that we recognize. It's largely been elected and is representative, and we could either choose to pull out completely, and I believe the Afghan government would be defeated and it would collapse and it would be another completely failed state harboring a lot of terrorists. Or we can keep doing the same thing we're doing, and I don't think we should do that either. This is an off-road to end the war and to bring the troops home and be done.
We'll go to Chris, Racine, Wisconsin, Republican line with Erik Prince. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm just kind of conflicting the story about $1 trillion for the facts that I've gained. It's $6 trillion. Okay, I got 3 points. That's the first point. The other one is Korea, DNK. That's a scary situation. I think that we need to. I don't know exactly what to say about that, other than we can't let them loose. And the third point is Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Israel. All those factors are it's trouble.
Thank you, Chris.
Look, I agree. The United States has spent an enormous amount of money between Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria, and all the rest. I'm wanting the United States to stop spending that kind of money. I would like to cauterize this kind of the unending bleeding wound we have in Afghanistan. There was Americans killed as recently as last week. 2 kids in their 20s driving back from a meeting with a provincial governor, blown up on their way back to the base. The Taliban will continue to do that. They know how to fight the United States. They know how to prick at us and to cut and to cut and to cut. The United States is largely on the defense just in Afghanistan, and it's time to bring that to an end while not giving the terrorists sanctuary. On the issue of $1 trillion versus $6 trillion, I said it's $1 trillion just in healthcare costs we haven't paid for. I don't disagree with you that we've already spent more than $6 trillion.
We'll go to Sydney, Alexandria, Louisiana, independent line. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask Mr. Prince if he is going to be responsible for the hospital bills and all on his people, because in Iraq they ended up on Social Security because the corporations, as soon as they got back to the state and were injured, they were fired and ended up on Social Security, and they had several programs showing this on C-SPAN.
Thank you, Sydney.
So any contractor that goes abroad on behalf of the U.S. government should have what's called Defense-Based Act insurance, and that is a long-time disability insurance in case they're injured, or there is a death benefit annuity for any surviving family members. So if there are cases like that, those are sure an anomaly, and that was not the case with any of our former employees.
Who is funding the Taliban?
So the Taliban is largely self-funding. They make money off opium, hash, gold, marble, lapis. Okay. Sadly, we've been there for 16 years, and there's still not a mining law or an energy law. The Taliban have figured out how to make money, so they're taxing those areas that are producing those resources and keeping a huge chunk of the money, while any legal miners can't actually do it legally because there's no law in place. There is some support coming from Pakistan, I'm told, but largely, between waste from the U.S. military, graft and corruption from the Afghan government, and those trading in those commodities, the Taliban is very well funded.
And when you talk to the Afghan people, not the military, not officials, what do they tell you?
They are most concerned about being abandoned because they know what the consequences would be if the U.S. pulls out. For example, the Afghan government had a bad week last week. They lost an entire company, chewed up to a Taliban ground attack. 50 or 60 dead, 30 or 40 captured, barely 20 guys escaped. Where's the close air support? Where's the reaction forces? Where's the help from the United States or from the other Afghan forces? As I lay out this plan with embedded structure at the battalion level with air support and medical support, those kind of problems go away. And they realize that and they appreciate that.
And I'm curious, if your company, and that's a hypothetical, but if it did get involved, and your sister, who is the education secretary, Betsy DeVos, is there any conflict of interest with your sister serving in the cabinet?
Not at all. The education department is a very separate part of government.
Let's go to Elizabeth, joining us from Fairfax, Virginia, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. I would like to ask Mr. Prince if he's considered asking his sister husband, Mr. DeVos, about maybe he could fund his private military. And I'd also like to ask him, to what address should I send my tax money, since he wants to privatize basically everything in the government. Everybody's all up in arms about having to pay for health care. The government's mandating them to buy something they don't want. I don't want to send my money to Mr. Prince or anyone like him, but I'm not going to be given that choice. How much money is Mr. Prince going to make out of this? Thank you.
I think the thing to focus on is trying to end the war in Afghanistan while denying terrorists sanctuary. And if that can be done for $1, great. Unfortunately, it can't be just done for $1, but we're spending $52 billion next year, $1 billion a week. Let's figure out a way to bring that to a close and return $40+ billion back to the Treasury.
Let me go back to the earlier point with regard to the warfare in the 21st century. Is the military nimble enough? Is it getting the right training to do some of the things that you say need to be done?
Well, here's the thing. Like I said, the Taliban now, they're on the best of their game because they've been at this for 16 years and they have that continuity in theater. The problem, the way the U.S. military deploys, is they send guys for 6 or 9 months, they deploy, and they leave. And that local area knowledge and experience leaves with them, and they don't come back to the same area. And so we've been fighting the same war 1 year 16 times, or even more than that. That is a inherent flaw in how the U.S. deploys, and any large bureaucracy is inherently not nimble. And so, yeah, it's a huge advantage to be able to come at this from a clean sheet of paper, and write down and do exactly what's needed just to accomplish that task, versus trying to build a building with a very unwieldy set of tools.
We've had a couple of calls on Blackwater USA. What is the status of that company today?
I sold it back in 2010, and it's run by a couple of, it's actually owned by a big New York hedge fund now, and they're continuing to do kind of security and bodyguard support to the U.S. government. I'm not involved with it in any way.
And what is the Frontier Service Group?
It's a logistics company. We do most of our business in Africa, so we do transportation of groceries and goods from Cape Town all the way up to the DRC, and we do aviation support out of Kenya and Malta across the continent. So we do a lot of medevac, VIP, and cargo movements by air.
Back to your calls. John, Falls Church, Virginia, independent line with Erik Prince. Good morning.
Good morning. Hey, Mr. Prince, I'm listening to you here. I love it. We've been at this for a long time with very little effect. You're bringing a lot of rational thought to a very emotional conversation, and that's a hard one to win. But we need to try something else. It's time, and I appreciate everything you're doing. I also see a lot of opportunities in this to bring in new technologies and a new way of fighting that the services just haven't been able to do. So keep it up. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, like I said, the Taliban the first time around were defeated by 100 CIA officers, a few hundred soft guys backed by air power. And going back to that relentless pressure on the Taliban and the other terror offshoots that exist in Afghanistan, this doesn't have to be so hard, and it doesn't have to cost so much. Let's figure out a way to bring this war to an end.
We were in touch with the Afghanistan ambassador to the U.S., and he said the following to C-SPAN, quote, "The Afghan government does not comment on the internal deliberations of other governments. We are reserving judgment until a formal policy is announced." Again, we're awaiting a decision by the president. Have you talked to General Mattis, General Kelly, and others about your plan specifically?
I've talked to General Mattis. I talked to him, and I have not talked to General Kelly yet because he's new into that position. But I think General Mattis even said that my analysis of the root problems that need to be addressed were the best he's seen. Now, he might not agree with my policy recommendations, meaning putting contracted guys into those roles, but he said the root problem, meaning sustaining the battalions from the bottom up with the structure, with long-term embedded mentors. I think that's a right approach, and he would agree.
So if your plan were to be implemented, how long would it take to succeed?
Well, it would take about 1.5 years to fully ramp up, to put into, the people into all those positions. There's almost 100 different battalions across Afghanistan. You would see significant changes on the ground within months because those Afghan battalions functioning much better, that have reliable air support, are going to put a lot more pressure on the Taliban. Here's the thing. What soldier in Afghanistan, what Afghan soldier right now wants to leave his base, knowing that he has almost no chance of any reaction force supporting him if they get in a big firefight, that if he gets wounded, he can die of a septic infection after 10 days because he didn't get antibiotics, and he is assured that he'll get no air support if they get into a fight. What Afghan soldier is confident of going into that fight? This model changes that.
Geographically, how big is Afghanistan comparable to, say, a state in the U.S., and how many people live there, do you know?
Bigger than Texas and about 30 million.
We'll go to Nick in Arlington, Virginia. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick. We can hear you.
Hi. My question for Mr. Prince is regarding the role of PMCs, private military companies, both in Afghanistan and going forward across the world. We're seeing an increase in insurgencies in Afghanistan, especially that can spread over to other countries such as Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. In Africa, there are constantly wars being waged between warlords. In the Philippines, factions associated with ISIS are causing havoc. In your opinion, how can corporations such as Blackwater and other PMCs going forward possibly enter these regions? Should they enter these regions? And let's just say that that is a possibility. what sort of oversight and what sort of regulation would need to be in place for that to happen?
Nick, thanks for the call.
Sure. You're right. There's a lot of insurgencies. There are more places on fire on Earth right now than any time in probably 50, 60 years. So the secondary effects of that, with them exporting terrorism, pushing a lot of migration and refugees out of those areas. So figuring out how to put out those fires is important. Those governments can turn to the private sector, like the U.S. government has, for the kind of training support, aviation, maintenance, logistics support to give them more enablers to get that job done. Anytime a U.S. company does that, it's regulated by the State Department, and it's controlled. And those rules are based on kind of the original arms export laws for preventing the sale of sensitive missile or weapons technology. Those could use some updating to make those more relevant, to make the United States a more helpful platform for helping these countries that are suffering from these insurgencies.
Our conversation with Erik Prince. He is proposing a plan to privatize the war in Afghanistan in his piece earlier this week, available online at usatoday.com. We'll go to Nancy joining us from Gresham, Oregon. Good morning.
Oh, yeah, hello there. So I was wondering what would be so catastrophic out of just leaving Afghanistan. The Russians did. They didn't. They had their belly full of it. We didn't win in Iraq. We didn't win in Afghanistan. We didn't win in Vietnam. What makes those countries were ruled by other people long before now, and they were different rulers, different ways of living than ours, but we got by. Why can't we leave if the Russians couldn't do it? What makes you think we can do it? Thank
you, Nancy.
Well, the Russians had, early in the 80s, had largely pacified Afghanistan. It was $1 billion in 1980 dollars of U.S. lethal aid per year that drove the Russians, the Soviets, out of Afghanistan, to include providing the Afghans with surface-to-air missiles. Fortunately, no one has done that to the U.S. effort in Afghanistan. We're certainly not there to colonize it. We're not there to dominate it. The U.S. went there to try to prevent it from ever being used as a base of operations to launch a terrorist attack against the homeland after 9/11. Now, there's an argument to be made to just pull out completely. But doing that in this era of ISIS and lots of lone wolf individual type attacks, it serves as a caliphate, as a base for radical Islam to rally around. So as you go through the process of trying to defeat ISIS on the ground in Iraq and Syria, and if suddenly Afghanistan falls, which it would if the U.S. pulled out completely, you have another base of operations for an ISIS-like force. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So I try to provide here a cheap and solvable, sustainable option between pulling out completely or continuing the same level of heavy spending that we're doing. This plan costs less than 20% of what current spend is.
And as you have indicated in past interviews, there are a lot of fiefdoms inside Afghanistan which only contribute to the problem, correct?
Sure. There's certain things structurally that need to be addressed, like the mining law, like the energy law. There's $1 trillion of resources in the ground in Afghanistan that the Afghan government should be benefiting from taxes and job creation. Alas, it's kind of a diplomatic failure on the United States' part that we haven't pushed through those kind of laws to bring about some real economy there.
I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but let's just turn quickly to North Korea. Here's part of what the president said yesterday in New Jersey, and we'll follow that with a tweet just a short while ago.
The people that were questioning that statement, was it too tough? Maybe it wasn't tough enough.
And this morning, this from President Trump: military solutions are now fully in place, locked and loaded. Should North Korea act unwisely, hopefully Kim Jong-un will find another path. That from the president this morning.
So remember, Kim Jong-un killed his half-brother in an international airport with VX gas. He strapped his uncle to the end of a 60mm aircraft gun and blew him away. So he's not a rational guy. Those comments by the president, I don't think, are even directed at Kim Jong-un. They are designed to go to the people surrounding Kim Jong-un so that if they do something stupid, they realize it's not just him that's going to go, it's all of them. It's all of that leadership clique. Look, every time Kim fires a missile, it develops, it's a marketing project, and it's certainly a threat to the West. His nuclear missile program is Iran's nuclear missile program. And the proliferation problems of the other places that he would want to sell nuclear weapons becomes a real strategic problem to America, because the more rogue nations have those kind of nuclear weapons, it is a panoply of problems.
So can diplomacy work, or is conflict and potential war inevitable?
I sure hope conflict is avoided. If I were the United States, I think I would try a program like the United States did in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Remember, the wall came down, the Berlin Wall came down, because the people on the east side of the wall figured out what was on the west side of the wall. And really putting an information program together to push media in from the West, from the rest of the world into North Korea, would make it much harder for Kim to govern, right?
But China doesn't want that. They don't want to see a unified Korea.
They might not, but anything that makes Kim's life more miserable in governing is a good thing. A peaceful reunification is ideal. Even better if if a general steps up and removes Kim himself in Korea and then makes a deal to reunify or to carry on. But it's probably time to end the Kim dynasty.
And as you know, the question everyone seems to be asking, are you worried? Are you concerned? How do you answer that, you personally?
Well, if I lived in the first 20 miles next to the DMZ, that's certainly the most worrisome spot. But the fact is, if Kim, every time he tests, and he's testing off submarines now as well, and if he has the ability for a small nuclear device to get on a missile, yeah, him shooting it into South Korea or Japan or Guam, right? 400,000 American citizens there. That's a problem. So spending on missile defense technology and certainly deterrence. This is a place. It's a good example of why, you know, before we have to worry about another war in North Korea, let's finish the one we're in, that we've been in for the longest, and find a way to bring it to a close.
Let's turn back to Afghanistan and the statement yesterday by the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, John McCain of Arizona. He said the following: we must face facts that we are losing in Afghanistan, and time is of the essence if we intend to turn the tide. The goal of this strategy is to ensure that Afghanistan never again becomes a sanctuary for terrorists to plot and conduct attacks against America, our allies, or our interest. We need an integrated civil-military approach to bolster U.S. counterterrorism efforts, to strengthen the capability and the capacity of the Afghan government and security forces, and intensify diplomatic efforts to facilitate a negotiated peace process in Afghanistan. Your response?
It kind of sounds more of the same. I mean, you could have said that same thing in 2006, 8, 10, 12, 14, or now. The difference is, look, we need to have one person in charge, a lead federal official that is in charge of all U.S. policy for Afghanistan. Put one person in charge and make them responsible for it. We haven't had that. It'd be interesting to see Senator McCain's response if the president names that person. Then Senator McCain would expect to have oversight over that guy and be questioning back from Washington. Treat this like a bankruptcy. This has been going around and around in circles for 16 years. If you put a business into a bankruptcy, you have the court appoints a bankruptcy trustee. That's kind of what we need for this Afghanistan effort. To keep, let's do what we need to do to deny terror sanctuary, stabilize the Afghan government, and figure out how to leave. That's America's goal.
For Erik Prince, Joe is next, North Charleston, South Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning, Eric. Good morning, Steve. Let me give you a little background, Eric. I used to work for the federal government and for DOD. As a matter of fact, I was involved in logistics and helped outfit those 20-foot Connex boxes, those portable ATC units they used to take over to the sand. So I retired in 07. But anyway, You're familiar with the A-76 circular as a contractor. For the life of me, I've never understood, and don't take this wrong, I've always thought that the military should be an inherently governmental function. Of course, Steve, now let me explain something. The government is not supposed to compete with the private sector if the private sector can do a job more efficiently and more effectively than the government. Erik knows that. He's familiar with the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So aside from the money thing and tactics and strategy, I would like to go back to a hearing in the Senate and Armed Services Committee. By the way, thank goodness for C-SPAN that we can watch those things back. General Nicholson testified back in February, and my Senator Lindsey Graham questioned him in detail about what was needed to win in Afghanistan. He said he needed at least 30,000 more troops. Mm-hmm. He also said at that time that contractors outnumbered government guys 2-to-1 over there. I don't know if that was true. He expressed dismay in that Russia is constantly trying to undermine our efforts there. And he also said that if we don't win this thing over there and don't get that place stabilized, that we will feel their presence on this continent. Now,
Joe, I'm going to stop you there so I can give our guest a chance to respond. But thank you very much, and thanks for checking out our C-SPAN website at cspan.org. Erik Prince.
So let me answer last to first. You're right. There are more contractors in Afghanistan already. There's 26,000. 9,500 of those are Americans in Afghanistan. There's another 9,000 U.S. troops. So you're right. There are a lot of contractors there. The plan I'm advocating severely reduces all of those numbers. The question of inherently governmental comes up. I was born in the summer of 1969, the summer of Woodstock and Apollo 11. If you were to say, is it inherently governmental that only the U.S. government can put a rocket into space in 1969? Of course you would have said yes. But now, today, 2017, the only way the U.S. government gets to space is on a private contractor's rocket or, oddly, with the Russian space program. So this idea of what is inherently governmental, I think time and technology changes that line constantly.
Will from Lorain, Ohio. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. The first thing I would like to say is this whole thing's ridiculous. I mean, the Russians warned us 15 years ago, don't go into Afghanistan, you cannot win. And they were right. The second thing I would like to say is we're spending all this money, lots of money, between Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, you could rebuild every hospital and every school in America with the money we're spending over there. This would be putting Americans to work. It would be creating jobs, and you'd have monies to build up or support the entitlement programs that we need for people. I mean, this whole thing, like I said, this whole thing is just ridiculous.
I think the president agrees with you. He's said repeatedly in media reports he is not comfortable with the same big military, big spending approach in Afghanistan. And I think he wrestles with pulling out completely and putting that money to work back in the United States in infrastructure versus spending it. I tried to provide him an option to keep pressure on the terrorists and still return more than $40 billion back to the budget to spend here in America.
From Kingsland, Georgia. Rick, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, C-SPAN, for your service to our nation. I have a couple of comments. First, as far as a ground war in Afghanistan, history teaches us that it's the last foreign general to win a ground war in Afghanistan was Alexander the Great, about 300 BC. Secondly, privatization of the military is a terrible idea. Writers from Clausewitz, all the way back through history, mercenaries have always been a failure. Mercenaries cannot be trusted. Mercenaries are there for a profit, and their allegiance is to money and not to a nation. And Mr. Prince, I think you revealed your motive when you tried to compare our function in Afghanistan to a business. Government is not in place to realize a profit. And so the analogy with a business in bankruptcy is not well taken. Thank you.
I would say the effort is in bankruptcy. The fact that the Afghan state is 90+% dependent on donor funds to operate, and that even our Secretary of Defense acknowledges we're not winning, having spent close to $1 trillion. Any rational observer or investor could characterize that as being in bankruptcy. Again, trying to save a lot of money and putting this thing, trying to find an off-ramp for the longest war in history is important. And as to the idea of mercenaries or contractors, I respectfully, strongly disagree with you. I think anyone that looks at the history of the Flying Tigers, what they accomplished against the Japanese, even Winston Churchill praised those guys, those contractors, those former Army, Navy, and Air Force pilots that went to work for a Chinese company back in 1940 to defend China from Japanese aggression. Churchill equated those pilots to the same work that the RAF did in the Battle of Britain.
Time for two more calls. Ed from Middleburg, Virginia. Thank you for waiting with Erik Prince. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Hi, Mr. Prince.
Good morning, especially in Middleburg. Hoo-yah.
Yeah, I think that, you're trying to come up with some innovative solutions, which is excellent. However, just a couple of points. One of the things that I would say is that, have you heard of Silkways Airlines and the arming from Arsenal in Bulgaria to various Boko Haram and ISIS and other folks that this airline has been conducting? All the manifests with the tail numbers of all the airplanes and everything are available on crowdsourcethetruth.org. And it would seem to me that it would make a lot of sense to try to cut out all those black arms and those rat lines going to all of these fighters that are fighting against our troops.
Are you familiar with this?
Look, is there leakage in illegal arms trade in the world? Absolutely. Sadly, that's not even that necessary in Afghanistan, because when the Taliban can roll over an Afghan base and destroy it, just like they did last week, and capture all the U.S.-provided arms and munitions, they're kind of self-supporting at that point.
This headline from the Washington Post back in April: the Blackwater founder held a secret Seychelles meeting to establish a Trump-Putin back channel. Is the headline accurate?
Well, as I said earlier this week on media, I was actually introduced incidentally to a Russian guy while I was at a business meeting in the Seychelles. It had nothing to do with the U.S. government. It had nothing to do with the Trump administration or anything to do with the United States, really. So
you have not been contacted by anyone investigating this?
Not at all. Nope.
What do you think of President Trump?
I feel for the guy. As much negativity as there is attacking him, look, he's a multi-billionaire. He was living a comfortable life, but he cares about his country, and he decided to step up and do something about it. And to be reviled, I think the guy could cure cancer, and the left would still criticize him for curing cancer somehow. So I think he is in a thankless position. I am extremely thankful that he is president and not Hillary Clinton. And I think he's, as the administration comes together, there'll be good things ahead.
Is his rhetoric appropriate?
The rhetoric, particularly at Kim Jong-un, like I said, I think that was directed at the circle around Kim. Having clear definition coming from the United States about what the consequences are of firing missiles at Guam is absolutely appropriate.
Our last call is from Salt Point, New York. Rich, thank you for waiting with Erik Prince. Good morning.
Hi. I'd just like to say it's not the terrorists that scare me. It's you that scares me. Sir, you are nothing more than a warmonger and a baby killer. And I'm sure there's a special place in hell for you.
Well, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm trying to figure out how to end the war in Afghanistan and bring the troops home. And I would question, what have you done to do that as well?
Final question. Let's go back to our earlier point. Is privatize the right word in terms of what you want to do in Afghanistan?
First of all, let's end the war. I think everybody, left, right, or center, wants to figure out a way to bring the troops home. And in doing that, you have to leave some kind of infrastructure in place to keep the Afghan security forces upright and effective. This is a model to do that. People want to complain about contractors in Afghanistan. There's already 26,000 there. This number reduces that by 80%. So, I'll certainly take criticism. People like opinions have criticism to throw around. But The fact is, these are difficult problems, and for the United States to pull out of Afghanistan completely and leave a terrorist safe haven is a real problem. And so, a solution to that, people can criticize me for that, but you know, if you're not over the target, you're not taking flak.
If people want to follow you on Twitter or on the web, how can they do so?
I'm not on either.
Your website, though, your company?
Sure. I mean, but that doesn't pertain to anything to do with solving Afghanistan.
Erik Prince, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks.
We appreciate it. When we come back, we'll